The most valuable tools on the range are not your fancy shot timer, it's not your gun with your fancy optic and cool paint job, and it's not your pacer so you feel like you're Matt Pranka. The most valuable tools on the range are words. I'm Jeff with Tenicor. In the last 20 years, I have been very serious about shooting and about training and about teaching. I have shot hundreds of thousands of rounds. I have trained for thousands and thousands of hours and had thousands of students in class. One of the most common training tools that people use that they don't really think about are words or cues. We're going to talk in depth today about training cues. So let's first talk about what a cue actually is. In the context of training, a cue is a word or a very simple phrase that connects to a more complex concept. The best way to think about it is like a shortcut that unlocks information or unlocks performance. And it can make either you as an individual cueing yourself, or if your coach cues you, to basically instantly connect you to a higher level of performance or a higher understanding of performance. So task layering is the idea that if you stack up tasks on top of somebody, at some point they'll break. And that point is different for everybody. And a cue is something that can help refocus the person. It can refocus them on what performance is important. Cues are very common in all sorts of aspects of life, but they're really helpful in human performance things. So lifting in the gym, a super common cue is knees out. So when people are doing some sort of squat, particularly under load, knees will have a tendency to buckle in. Using the cue knees out will connect the person back to the bigger discussion about what a proper squat looks like. So one question is, what makes a good cue? They should be short because it should be easy and quick in the moment during the task layering to cue the action and then perform that. They should be positive because you're trying to achieve something. The cue should point you to where you're going, not dragging you back into where you shouldn't be. And then finally, they should be memorable. The word should be associated specifically with the action that you're trying to perform. So sometimes cues are kind of general and universal, and they can be used for different people under the same circumstances. Other times, it can be something that is very specific to the person. And so you could have some sort of one-on-one coaching circumstance where the person describes, hey, this is what we want you to do, and they relate it to something specific in your life. So one example is a conversation I had with a guy. He was very comfortable surfing. We kind of talked about how his body stands and how he moves while he's surfing, and connecting that to the shooting process. And so then the cue that was used later on was just the word surfing. So a cue doesn't have to be hyper serious for the task. It just has to connect you back to the performance. And so oftentimes if the cue is humorous or funny, that is actually better because it can refocus the mind and focus on what is important in the performance and not on the pressure or the task layering. So if a cue doesn't connect back to some deeper understanding of performance, it's not going to be very helpful. So a common cue that is used in shooting is front sight. Front sight, front sight, front sight. You go to some law enforcement academy or your average NRA instructor with their red shirt. That is something commonly that you're going to hear. As a coaching cue, it is often just empty or hollow. So some people say it's a terrible thing and you should never talk about it. I think it's a perfectly fine cue, but it's just become cliche because the cue itself, front sight, is divorced from what you're actually doing. So you have to set up some sort of instruction or some sort of experience where the shooter sees their front sight in an interesting and unique way that will lead to performance. And so they have that experience in their mind. And so when you cue front sight, it is cueing the person back to that experience so that while they're shooting then, they are like, oh yeah, I'm supposed to see my front sight like this. And then they shoot. So cues are really helpful, but oftentimes people make mistakes with cues. So let's talk about some common mistakes and some ways to avoid that. So the cue, don't miss. The problem with that is that it's negative. You're focusing on what you shouldn't do, not on what you're trying to achieve. So if someone says, properly and safely index your trigger finger high on the slide of the weapon system. The challenge with that coaching is that it's not a cue. It is neither short nor is it memorable. Index would be a way to summarize that and replace that. Super common for people to use numbers as cues, particularly when they're trying to break down a new skill. So something like the draw stroke, people will have like 1, 2, 3, 4. That is helpful to break it down and it's short, but it's not really that memorable. You're not associating what number 2 is with anything. It's also not positive, it's really kind of neutral because it's not driving you towards any sort of action. So using things like 1, 2, 3 isn't a shortcut. It's actually introducing an extra step. Your brain has to like translate and problem solve and figure that out. So it's actually another task layer that you would be putting on top of somebody rather than just saying grip. Instead of one, you say grip because it's super clear what grip is. For all of us, one means all kinds of things, and it just depends on the context. We're going to talk now about some of the cues that we use at Tenicor when we're coaching people with shooting. A super common cue is tap, rack, bang. And some people might have some debate about whether that's the proper process or whatnot, but it is a very well done cueing thing because you're saying tap as in tap the base of the magazine, rack as in rack the gun, and then bang as in shoot. And so it is short, it is positive, and it is memorable. If I am showing someone the draw, I'll typically use grip, clear, join, and sight. And I use sight for iron sight shooters. If I'm gonna do red dot stuff, then I need to transition from sight to target because I don't actually want them to see the dot. And so as an iron sight shooter, to have the most accurate shooting, you want to be focused on your front sight. And there are certainly times where you might be target focused, but the harder skill to learn for most people is focusing on their front sight, so I will usually cue that. But for a red dot shooter, it's the exact opposite. You always want to be focused on your target. So I don't want to cue sight. I want to cue target when they're at the end of their draw stroke. Oftentimes I'll use the cue rear sight, and the cue rear sight is connected to the correct motion of the gun driving to the target. And so oftentimes people will go muzzle up, and I'm trying to get people to move the gun flat to the target. And if you cue like front of the gun or front sight, it's going to tip up. If you cue rear sight, it's very close to the pivot point of the gun, and people will typically keep the gun much more flat as they drive the gun to the target. Somebody could cue front sight and someone could cue rear sight. To someone without context, that might sound very similar, but we're cueing totally different things. So usually if I'm using the front sight cue, I'm trying to cue them back to, during the shooting process, what a front sight is supposed to look like. If I'm cueing rear sight, I'm cueing them to what is the proper path of motion moving from the ready or the join position out to fully extended on the target. Red dot shooters struggle to maintain target focus. And there's a variety of different coaching techniques that people will use to try to do that. A common one, and one that I use, is trying to pick some sort of very specific thing on the target and have hyper detail. Usually I will talk about like the perforation of the tear on the tape as something that you want to look at. You want to look at detail that is that small. And so conversation with Matt, he liked the word detail as the coaching cue, and I think that makes a lot of sense. So you could describe what it is the person is supposed to be doing while they're shooting a red dot. You could go to the target and be like, this is the thing you're supposed to look at. It is that detail. And now you have summarized that whole conversation in the word detail, and detail becomes a cue. In shooting, we often talk about follow through as something, and follow through being new sight picture, new prep trigger, or on the trigger again, ready to shoot again, and basically ready to shoot the gun again, and we talk about that as follow through. I've found that most students find that really confusing. It hit me why, because it's not really follow through. Like follow through, if we think about throwing a baseball, follow through is the completion of the action. It's not the reset for the next action. Pretty much any athletic performance thing, follow through is the continuation of the motion to completion. It is not resetting for the next thing. In shooting, we use it as a reset for the next thing, and I think that is a misuse of the term follow through. And so I started using the term next up. And so I use the term next up as a cue for complete the shot and be ready to shoot another one. And I'll do an explanation of that so people understand that. But I've kind of moved away from using the term follow through and moved towards using the phrase next up. About a year and a half ago, Mark Smith came up here and ran a class for our team. In that, he was talking about grip. While talking about grip, he talked about a walnut as a way to help demonstrate proper grip and proper pressure and proper tension in your hand. Later on, Matt and I were talking about grip, and that walnut thing was very helpful for Matt to kind of visualize what he is supposed to be doing with grip. So that got us into a deeper discussion about apples and bananas and how apples and bananas will solve your grip problems. And so I've used that cue now for the last year or so with a bunch of people, and it seems to help. So if you're interested in trying to improve your grip, go check out this video.